call the August meeting of the Community Development, Housing, and General Government Committee to order. As normal, we will take the consent agenda and then we will move to the general agenda. Are there items on the consent agenda that members of the council and committee would like to have pulled? Devin? Mr. Larson?
Yes, C5, C6, and C16.
And C16. All right. Are there individuals who are present here for demolition cases that are listed for demolition but would have a comment or concern in reference to the demolition? I see 1, 2, 3, 4 hands in the back. And please indicate from the front to the back which properties those are. C7. C7? Yes. Uh-huh. Who's the next?
3010 North Glen Avenue. I don't have one in the program.
232 C7.
C7. Okay. Is there another person in the back? I saw another hand.
Yes, I'm looking to another property called 2029 Basin Street.
Say again. 2029.
C8.
C8. 2029 Basin.
C8. And then, is there another? Before I'm getting ready to say something you might need to hear before you go out the door. So hold a second. Sir, in the green shirt, you had your hand up too? Yes, sir. Which property?
It's 2026 North Cherry Street.
C13.
C13. In
26 is C16.
C10. Bowen Boulevard.
Okay, and so for any of those properties that, and those individuals who are present, if you desire, if you can say that you'll have that property rectified and the issues cleared within 90 days, if you can agree to that within 90 days, raise your hand. Please see a staff member in reference to those items, and if the committee, just for the conscious of time, that they're already committing to those, if there's not objection from the committee, if we could get the exact number on those, we'll take that with the consent agenda. Madam Attorney, can we do it that way? That number again for is C7, and sir, in the back, the property that you had?
It was 2029 Basin.
C8.
C8. So for item C8 and item C7, the individuals indicate that 90 days will be a sufficient amount of time to clarify that. And so without objection, we will include that within the action today, that we will extend that time frame by 90 days for the repair or demolition order, to give them 90 days for those two items. Other individuals, you would still like to be heard on those. Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
Is that 90 days in addition to whatever time is already in the order?
Yes,
Okay.
the 90 days. Yep. All right. Okay. Staff, those individuals, please see staff member so that they can engage with you on that. Can I get a motion?
I move approval of 7 and 8 with the 90-day additional times to bring the property into compliance,
Along with the rest of consent.
along with the rest of consent.
All right. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor indicate by voting yes. Those opposed, no. And I just saw a couple people enter the room just now. If anyone who entered the room, are you here for a demolition case?
Yes.
What number is that? What is the property address, sir?
1628 East 22nd Street. City of Zone.
So these numbers don't, these numbers are the same.
C9. Okay.
We have different numbers. Mr. Chairman,
All right.
some of these numbers on this sheet don't correspond with the numbers on our,
Okay. We'll
on our list.
We'll get it. All right. With that, we will take the consent agenda, and the consent agenda, we will start with item C5, and for those in the room today and for members of the committee and the council, I will ask that the rule of the day be brevity in your presentations and your remarks, for we have a lot that we need to get through, and there's a couple important presentations that we have. We want to make sure that we get to everybody on the agenda in time, not to overflow onto the Public Works agenda. Item C5.
Item C5, property located at Cherry Street duplex demolished by Habitat for Humanity.
All right, Mr. Larson, you asked for this item?
Yes, I'd like some clarification as to what our agreements were with the Habitat originally when the land was given to them, and the $65,000 that was authorized for the repair of that historic building, which I understand now has been demolished.
Okay, can someone give some background on this, and then I'll refer to the council member there.
Okay, the first question, council members, the first question I'm going to ask Mellon to come up here and join me, because that's going to be mostly information that their office collected about the original acquisition. It was in 2000. It was done as a foreclosure, and it was done preempting that, and I'll see if you need to add anything, but preempting the Old Cherry redevelopment project. And so that was, they were starting to gather the properties to start that project. Do we need to add anything to that?
No,
Both Mellon and I were, that pre-exists us, but that's what we've discovered looking through the files. The second question was regarding the contract for $65,000, correct?
I understand there was, yes, the contract, I guess, $65,000 was granted to Habitat for the rehabilitation of the structure, as I understand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the $65,000 contract has expired. It expired in February. The original contract was for Habitat. They gave them the lot, and they agreed to rehabilitate the structure. That was back in 2015, and then 2016 for the 65. We gave them the land actually in 2015. This year, Habitat came to me, and this is why I'm up here, so if you're all wondering what the historic person's doing, to do a review to ask for the demolition of the structure, because it was a contributing structure in the North Cherry Historic District listed on the National Register in 2004. We began discussions with the State Historic Preservation Office because that's what's required. We cannot just approve demolitions at our local level. We worked through the discussion with Renee Gledhill Early, who is their environmental person who does those sorts of reviews. We worked out a memorandum of agreement. I met back with Kelly Minter, who is here too, and asked him questions about different funding options and such. And then that's when I learned about this contract, and I went up to Mellon's office and discovered that in the contract it was just for rehabilitation. The earlier citation that I had seen in my review was rehabilitation, acquisition, or rehabilitation. So it was an or situation. So that contract has expired. Now, at this time then, if Habitat would want money from the city, and this is where I'm going to fall back on Mellon here, they would have to come back and work with their department to renew or make a new contract with the situation. The reason the property was demolished, a tree had fallen on it. It had been in serious decline and deterioration. There was a serious mold problem, and they were really scared about people getting into it and endangering. People were going to start fires and things like that. There had been several vagrants moving in, and there was a danger of something like that and losing their actual residents around the house.
Right.
So,
Mr. Larson, does that answer your question?
So is Habitat asking today for the $65,000 to be renewed? Is that what
today is just that is an informational item for you to understand what happened with that original contract.
Right.
And I'm going to let Mellon drop because that's
Well, just in that, I know there may be some more information that can come back on it since it is an information item, that some more information can come and Mr. Larson's questions can be answered. I know the council member is supportive of this. Ms. Adams, would you like to comment? Okay.
Yeah.
Can we make sure that Mr. Larson's questions get in the record and that his concerns get heard? Ms. Larson, final comments?
Yeah, my perception is that we had an agreement that has not been fulfilled in both the giving of the land to Habitat to rehabilitate a historic building. We gave additional funding to allow that rehabilitation to occur, and through a variety of circumstances, neither one of those have occurred. We now have a vacant piece of land that the Habitat has some claim to, I suppose, and we have an outstanding sort of informal agreement, I guess it's expired, of $65,000. So what I want is some clarification as to, one, does the ownership of the land still reside with Habitat since they did not fulfill their obligation? And two, is the $65,000 still in play in some form or another for the use on this vacant piece of property?
All right, thank you. Those are good questions. I think there are already answers to those that can be swiftly given to Mr. Larson to answer those, and that can be something taken up when there's action asked on this item. So we'll, information only, we're going to go ahead and move on to item C6.
Item C6.
Oh, we cleared item C6.
cleared it,
Yeah, so item C10. I'm sorry. Yeah, item
C10, ordinance ordering the demolition and removal of a structure with repairs more than 50% of the value of the structure. Property located at 2123 Bowen Boulevard in the Northeast Ward.
All right, staff, you want to come and give some presentation on this property? I know the gentleman is in the back who has to speak on this item.
Good afternoon. This is item C10. This is a 2017 case, 2123 Bowen Boulevard. The property has gone through all the due diligence requirements that are required of staff. Let me see if I can enlarge this. I need IS.
While you're trying to figure it out, the gentleman in the back, you come up as well. Get you ready to. You should come up to the mic here. Yep, right here where they are.
To the agenda. Okay.
Thank you. My apologies. I'm afraid to touch it. But Mr. Bohannon has talked with staff today, and I think a couple, maybe at least one other time before. We have done the due diligence and the due process required, and Mr. Bohannon has contacted staff and expressed the interest in performing more work on the property. This is a property that is in the 50% plus value of the dwelling. The estimated cost to repair the property is $10,086, and the fair market value is $5,000.
All right, you can come and give your name and address for the record, and then.
Blake Bohannon, my residence, my personal residence, 1433 Hannaford Road, Winston-Salem.
Okay, and so what is your desired action to take on this property? Staff has been in contact with you. What is your desire?
We plan on fully renovating. We had purchased it, and with the intentions of, we purchased it last year as a foreclosure with intentions of selling it soon after. But we have held on to the property just for other reasons. And a business partner, the other owner on this property, the Luke Jones, everything was actually going to his address, and I was not made aware that there was a notice. So once I was made aware, I actually didn't know until the Cherry Street property. And once I was made aware with the Cherry Street property and this one, is when I contacted their office and let them know that. And within just a few weeks ago, I just put a new roof on it, new steps leading up to the home, and we have full intentions of continuing those.
Okay, to staff question, the images we have say 731. Do we have today's pictures?
Yes.
And to the point, sir, that what was asked earlier to other individuals, which was granted, was that a 90-day extension was given in terms of them to be able to bring the property up to code. And if they agreed to be able to bring it up to code, then they would sign a VDA, voluntary demolition order, meaning that if you failed to meet that standard, then you're saying that you're going to give yourself that 90 days to bring it up. And just for information, what those individuals were granted. You have the pictures there, Ms. Johnson?
I do. I'm sorry. The pictures that you, of course, have in your cases are what we entered prior to the meeting, and this is this is August 13th.
It's hard to see, but that's the new roof on there. It's hard to see in the picture, but that's one of the darker roofs. But it is boarded up.
So what's the time that you think it would take to bring the property up?
Probably somewhere between 90 and 120 to 60 days. I wasn't sure if 90 days would do it, and I don't want to. Is there any type of?
I will yield to the members of the committee. Council member of the ward isn't here and isn't present in reference to that, but I do know that in the past.
What I told her, I mean, anything that is a direct violation, I will immediately address those things. And if those are within the 90 days that you speak of, yeah, I can address any violations immediately. Just the full move-in ready to have it absolutely
it's the violation.
Perfect.
It is the violations
yeah.
that are existed there. Sorry, Madam Attorney.
I asked earlier if you were adding 90 days to the time period already given. So you said yes, so that more than likely it's going to be a total of 180 days. So are you asking him if he can do it in 180 days as well?
Correct. That's the total amount.
That'd be the total amount, absolutely.
And that's something I'll look to the committee to. I will say, and I will reserve my comments, but I'll look to the committee for a recommendation on this item. Mr. Bessie?
Inquiry would be, it doesn't appear that we've had an internal inspection. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. When a place has this kind of violation on the outside, there are often serious internal issues as well. Have you had an opportunity? Well, I assume you've had an opportunity to get in and inspect the inside.
Yeah, we've more or less opened it up and cleaned it out. It was like an old rental property, so I mean, it more or less had just debris and things like that. But we keep them boarded up just to make sure they're not broken into. But aesthetically, I understand. I mean, it doesn't look pleasing. So I mean, I can address it as soon as I possibly can when it comes to it.
When you are saying, market ready for leasing,
Mm-hmm.
are you including inside repairs like electrical, plumbing, heating, internal and structural integrity, all of that?
Well, that's also what I was asking. Is the 90 days that I was given for the actual, violation that I've come across today, or does it need to? Is it at a move-in ready situation?
Technically, what the violations are, what are listed, but I don't know that it's in anyone's best interest to have it sitting for an extended period of time with internal.
Right. Well, I mean, it's I've got other properties across the city. It's not my intentions to have any assets sit. This was purchased with full intentions to sell. The adjoining lots in the foreclosure didn't. It's a long process, but they didn't foreclose correctly, and to sell that property, I have to pay off the adjoining land that is not currently in my name, and I've had multiple attorneys deal with this, but I bought it as a foreclosure, and unless I want to pay $6,000 to the adjoining lots, which are vacant, I need to hang on to it. And in its current state, I can't clear $6,000 to even pay off the adjoining lots. So I have to get it income producing as a rental, or yeah, I mean that's pretty much my scenario.
We have
Yeah.
dealt with some,
Right.
multi-property owners in town who have a bad history of, buying more than they're capable of.
Well, I mean,
addressing.
when it comes to like upkeep and mowing, like you'll see my properties, they don't have violations on them for mowing, and I try to keep everything up.
Thank you. I've asked the questions that I have. Perhaps Councilmember Adams has.
Yes. Out of all of the properties we have on our sheet, Chair, 10 of them are in the urban core of African-American neighborhoods. And when I know where this property is on Bourne Boulevard. When you look up on the hill, when you drive by. I know people think that we don't, at times, be as forgiving as we should be to developers and property owners and whatever, people that rent, sell property. But in the African-American neighborhoods, sir, this is unacceptable. This is unacceptable. I mean, even though you say there's some issues behind the property, and pardon me, Chair, I have to say this because looking at this, like so many of us, we get very upset because it's okay for this to be in our neighborhoods, but we don't see this in nobody else's neighborhoods across town. So my comment to you is if you said you got to get this one right before you can deal with the other two, you might want to get with this quickly. Whatever time, Madam Attorney, that we can allow this gentleman, whatever that is, Chair. But this can't be, these type properties cannot sit in our communities, and we are the elected body, allow this to happen. And every time people come down here, we've been here 10 years, I get the same, we could record it and just play it, and everybody says the same thing. Councilman McIntosh, you in the property real estate sale business, you've heard it. Frankly, I'm just, all I can say is, Chair, do what you got to do, but this needs to be reckoned with along with these others, because all these pictures that we see right now, this is totally unacceptable, totally.
Madam Attorney, I see your hand. You want to provide something?
Just one point of clarification. When they sign the VDA, they have to bring the property up to code, not just the violation.
Yeah.
I'm going to make sure everybody understands.
Yeah.
Not just the things that are cited in the notice, that the entire property has to be brought up to code. So if you give them that additional time, whatever it is, he needs to understand, it needs to be brought up to code.
In fact, Mr. Chair, I did want to clarify, would that include an internal inspection?
In my opinion, yes.
Yeah,
Bringing it up to code means
Means
inside and
everything.
outside.
Right. So, what we would have in this is we would have your agreement that the internal would be brought up to
Yeah, absolutely.
habitability.
And I want it to be at least minimum code at very, very minimum. I mean, yeah.
Right.
Is there a recommendation, a motion?
I'd move authorization of a VDA with under the same conditions as the previous ones.
Is there a second? All right, that motion has been made and second. My only comment in this process is I agree with many of the comments that have already been made. You also have another property on the list that we're going to be talking about, and Councilmember Bessie made the statement very clear. In the past, when we have multiple property owners who come before us for properties that are not maintained properly, it questions whether or not becomes a habitual violator that just has properties that don't take care of them, and people in the neighborhoods suffer because you have someone who purchased properties but don't necessarily have all the ability to bring them to the place that they want to bring them. They may have good intentions,
Right.
but don't have everything that they need to bring them up, and the people in the neighborhood have to sit back and watch the properties decline. And so, I'm
sorry.
just,
Go ahead.
and so with that in mind, I think that the committee is offering a bit of grace to be able to see this come into fruition, because nobody wants to tear down the properties, want to see them restored and rehab, but understand that the neighbors have to deal with what they see in these pieces. So the motion has been moved and properly second. All in favor? vote by saying yes. Those opposed, vote no. That's unanimous.
Yes, Mr. Chair, if I can just, kind of a closing comment. Mr. Mahan, I don't recall seeing you here before the committee before. But there are some folks who we've seen year after year, and they have the pattern. They buy more than they can take care of, and then it cycles. Right. In terms of they'll fix the immediate violations, and then before they get rented out, there'll be another set of violations, and they'll be back on the whole new list of properties, including some that have been through the process before. And that's what we want to try to get away from.
That makes sense. I mean, absolutely makes sense. And I have a good track record of bringing properties back. And I mean, I don't want to go through with them, but I mean, 1808 Longview and 1936 Dacian, 1819 Center Street at the School of the Arts. Waughtown is an area that we try to frequent. I mean, these are homes that, I bring them back to an HGTV, look. I mean, I try to, do as much justice as I possibly can.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. McIntosh.
I just want to make a quick comment. I mean, we don't want to tear buildings down. What we want to see is that house back in service, in a livable condition as quickly as possible. That's what the goal here is. So work with us. We'll work with you.
All right, don't go too far, because we're going to go to item C13 and ask staff to give a report here. No, just stay there. Yeah, stay right there a second. I'd ask if the committee would be willing to grant the same thing on this, but this appears to be a burnout, and so I...
C16.
16?
Yeah.
2026.
Oh, see 16 in the book?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was getting ready to give you
Same owner.
Okay, here we go. Okay.
It's the stair. Why stair?
So procedurally, was the vote earlier?
So
13.
staff.
I thought we removed 16.
I'm sorry, Madam Attorney. What is?
He was asking me procedurally what the vote was on. I thought the vote was on 13 and you had removed 16. Because I was looking at what was on the system.
The items that were moved were item C10, which was the 2123 Bowen Boulevard property, and then this one here, which is the 2026 property, which is now what we're discussing, which is a proper. What? Yeah.
Okay. I understood 16 was removed, 13 was voted.
Great.
Okay. Staff report, please.
This next item, and by the way, just as a quick footnote, all of the folks that came today to this hearing have been noted on your summary council sheet in front of you, and have been contacted or have been in contact with staff. So all of you that have a sheet like this, the comments are in red, because all of the folks that appeared before you today that went outside with us, they contacted staff, and we made their comments. So this case, 2026 Cherry Street Apartments, the staff followed the due process items. The complaint and notice of hearing were served. The finding and order, the RVO, customer was notified. The repair and vacate order was delivered. Customer was served. All notifications were delivered. And Mr. Bohannon again would like to address, although we talked to him, he would like to address the committee and ask for more time.
Okay. Do you have updated pictures? I know we have some newer pictures in here today. Do you have any additional pictures that shows anything additional than what we have in our book?
Yes.
And Mr. Bohannon, before you speak, I'm going to ask the council member that ward if she already has a recommendation on what she'd like to hear from you.
Well, I can see that you've been working on this property, again, as part of the historical district of the Cherry Street. It's part of the Y stairs. And again, I grew up going in and out of those when I was growing up. Again, we don't like tearing down properties, particularly the ones that are historical in nature to the African American community, because we don't have that much left. So, I commend you for going ahead and doing this. But, this property's been sitting there burned out for a long time. And I've gotten comments from the people in the community about it, the homeowners, the Habitat neighbors, and everybody else. So I'm hoping that you can do what you've done in such a short time, because I drove by there a couple of 2-3 weeks ago and it didn't look like this. So I'm hoping that you can facilitate making this happen very quickly. We'd love to see this property back up and grace in the neighborhood the way the other one is and the way that it was before it got burned out. So I'm going to recommend the same thing that we did for the other property, if that's okay, Chair.
Right. Additional 90 days, a total of 180 days. Is there a second?
Yes.
Councilman Bessie had a comment. Oh, motion.
Sorry.
Mr. Chairman.
Hold just a second. There's a motion and approved. All right. All those in favor?
Can I just?
No, sir. You in a good place right now, so stay right. All right, Councilmember Larson, a quick comment.
There is a complication in the sense that this property has a third player in it, and that's the state organization called Historic Preservation, North Carolina Historic Preservation, that has deed covenant on this property. And I think they have a representative here tonight, but they have guidelines and requirements of how that building is to be restored and the historical aspects of it to be preserved. And I don't know whether that will affect the restoration schedule or not, but it is not a normal construction process if the historical aspects of this building are to be preserved. It might be useful to hear from Preservation North Carolina as to what they expect in the restoration and whether that would impact what has to be done on the property.
Councilmember Adams.
That property has been burned out a long time. And if anybody wanted to do anything, they've had about, 4 years to do it? And this is what we get caught up in, Councilmember Larson. Like I was telling people, in the North Ward, I'm very expeditious about what I need to do as the representative of the North Ward in that community. If the historical people wanted to say something, I hope they've been getting with this gentleman. And they need to make sure that the exterior of that building is compliant to the days we've recommended, the outside. They can work on the inside, but we need to go ahead and get something done. To drive down Old Cherry Street, get to Kimberly, get to Habitat, get to all those new homes. 4 years is long enough. They had time. That's how I look at it. And anybody want to call me, they can call me. But like the chair said, they're in a good place right now. And the historical people, as much as I love them too, they need to get with the program as well.
All right, there's a motion on the floor. As voted, those in favor say aye. Vote yes. Those opposed, no. That's unanimous. All right.
Thank you.
And if you make sure before you leave, you get engaged with staff on both of those so that they can give you the information that you need as you move forward. And if there are folks that are here from Historic Resource, make sure you all have information so you all can be in communication. All right. Thank you very much. All right. That was item C13 on this sheet, but C16 in our agenda book. So that was where the confusion was there. Yeah. All right. So to ensure that we have one other item on the demolitions, which was item C9, which is 1628 22nd Street. I believe the gentleman in the rear came in on that item. Did he leave? All right. Without objection, because I know somebody was here to be heard on this item, I'll ask if we can hold this and make sure that ask staff to engage with them because they were here to speak on that item. I'm not sure what happened. They may have thought that we'd moved past that, but to be fair, ask that we hold this in committee until next month, engage with them just to make sure that they knew that we did not pass on that item. Is that okay with the committee?
Yes.
Okay. That was item C9. Is that clear, all the items that would be pulled off of consent. All right. We'll now move to the general agenda, item G1.
Item G1, ordinance amending the project budget ordinance for the City of Winston-Salem for the fiscal year 2018-2019 to appropriate funds for the National League of Cities CHAMPS Cities Combating Hunger Initiative.
Good afternoon, Chairman Montgomery, members of the committee. Back in May, the city was selected to be a part of just a small group of chosen communities to participate in the CHAMPS Leadership Academy. CHAMPS stands for Cities Combating Hunger. And the CHAMPS initiative, it's made possible by the Walmart Foundation. The whole idea is it's helping cities to design citywide anti-hunger campaigns that will raise awareness of and help to combat hunger in the chosen cities. So our participation in that academy made us eligible for funding to carry out the anti-hunger campaign. And fortunately, we were among one of 6 cities nationwide that was selected to receive funding from the Walmart Foundation in conjunction with the National League of Cities to carry out the campaign. And Councilmember Adams represented us at that academy. And so this item just amends the budget to accept the grant funding from the National League of Cities in the amount of $115,500.
I move for approval.
Is there a second? Any question or comments on the motion, or any comments at all? Councilman Adams?
Just wanted to say there were 15 cities, was it, Mr. Raleigh, participating and competing for this grant with the help, again, with the staff and our federal advocate, Lisa Mazingo. We secured the $115. One of the things we're trying to do, again, is we provide meals throughout the city, feeding sites, but we do it either in the afternoons or mornings, whether children are out of school or in. What we're looking at doing here in the city is utilizing our recreation centers, which we know we need to get that kind of where people are coming more than they are. And we are looking at utilizing the recreation centers and starting with some prototype launches, the benchmarks in the urban core. And we're looking at providing, as we used to say in the country, supper. This is not dinner, this is supper, which means it's in the evening, probably after 6 o'clock. And it also will allow for their guardians and parents, grandparents, escorting them to be able to come and eat dinner and sit down with them. And we're not talking, fast food. We're talking an actual meal. And we're also talking about being able to, while they're there, again, do some resourcing and services projects there with partnering with other nonprofits, as well as the city, and getting things out to the community that they may not know about. So we're looking forward to this. I did tell the other 14 cities, Regina and myself, that Winston-Salem was going to get one of those grants, and we did. Did Durham get it? Because that's who was telling me Durham got theirs too. Okay. All right. But again, Evan and staff, thank y'all so much, community development, for helping us to move this along, as well as the mayor for his participation, because that was the critical piece. You had to have the mayor brought in on this deal in order for you to even be considered. So thank you.
All right. There's a motion. All in favor, vote yes. Those opposed, no. That is unanimous. We look forward to it. Thank you, Councilmember Adams and the rest of the team, for your work on this item. Item G2. And actually, before you read that, if there's just, I'm going to ask the committee, I know this will be a presentation that's going to go along with this. Is there new items and information to be presented on item G3? Because all of the committee members were here on yesterday.
I don't have any additional comments or questions.
And so if it's okay with the council members and others present, we can hear item G3 and we can just move on past that so that we can get to the full length report.
Okay.
All right, item G3.
Item G3, consideration of a request for financial assistance from the Peters Creek Community Initiative.
Sure, I'll move for.
Okay.
No,
well, it was just information. Just information.
So
okay. So we're good to go.
We're informed.
All right. Okay. So item G3, folks, you're good to go. All right. Item G2, and then we'll move to item G4 after that.
Item G2, report regarding recommendations to meet housing need in Winston-Salem, Forsyth County.
helped y'all get to dinner sooner back there.
Good afternoon, Council Member and Chair Montgomery and rest of the committee.
Good afternoon.
So we are coming today, and I'll be presenting to you Dr. Hara Wright-Smith, who is part of Enterprise Community Partners. Enterprise, as you know, was engaged to create a housing study and do housing recommendations for us. Back in May, I brought to you data from the study to kind of give you a sense of the need for housing in our community. And so today, Dr. Smith will actually walk through the recommendations that are the basis of her report. And if we could find a plug to put this flash drive in, we'll actually get the report up on the screen, because in her presentation, she will be referring to specific page numbers where you can find the recommendations and the like. And so, and again, in May, brought you the data on the need and the housing gap. Today will be the recommendations that flow from those particular needs. We're going to get this going, and we'll pull up her.
And Ms. Newman, will the actual report for the greater public, is that online some way, or will it be posted online somewhere for the broader public to be able to review that information?
Yes, sir. It will be posted. There are some final minor edits that are being cleaned up at this point, and as soon as those are provided to us, we will post them on our website.
Okay, just so that the broader public can have access
Absolutely.
to the information.
Just see if the, I think what you're looking for.
Yes, 814. And again, as I stated, she is going to be walking through the set of materials that have been placed at your seats, but that set of materials will refer to the actual pages in the housing study.
Okay.
So,
all right.
On the screen. Okay. There we go. All right. And so I present to you Dr. Hara Wright-Smith, Enterprise Community Partners. Come down.
Oh, here.
Mm-hmm. Well,
To change page.
All right.
Good afternoon, Councilman Montgomery and committee members. Happy to be standing before you once again. I have been instrumental in, as Ms. Newman mentioned, over, I guess now, about 8 months of study of Winston-Salem, Forsyth County, and Enterprise Community Partners, on behalf of myself and my team, have concluded this work now. And I'm hoping you've had an opportunity to read this voluminous document. It's well over 200 pages or so, or very close, and it's focused on a lot of elements as it relates to housing need. So as mentioned earlier, the PowerPoint you have in front of you is just kind of excerpts from the larger document, right? So in the interest of time, I'm going to really touch on the high-level areas within the strategic framework of the larger document, identifying what we believe are the key needs that should be talked about today for Council's consideration. So if you'd like to follow through, then the PowerPoint you have in front of you, that would be fine. I'm going to be moving across several documents I have in front of me, so if you see me doing a little movement here, it's because I have certain things I'm referring to as well to make my points, but everything is driven from the larger document that we have on the screen. So I'm going to try to act a little bit like an octopus up here today. So I'm going to give you an overview of the housing study and needs assessment. I commend you for commissioning this work at a time where we believe now for the city of Winston-Salem it is much needed. The goal, quickly I'm going to do an overview. The main goal of this assessment had two critical parts. It was really to provide strategies to encourage diverse housing types and affordability levels throughout the city, and to really identify what those housing types and affordability levels are. Secondly, our goal is to, through this work, provide strategies to fill any housing gaps and really provide the rationale for the prioritization of funds for what we have identified as needs here. So
So what you're going to see today then, or what we're going to talk through, is an overview of those housing needs that will require perhaps council involvement and certainly council participation on certain actions that we have identified as being critical. I want to just kind of walk through, before we get to certain strategic elements in the study, give you a sense of where the recommendations came from. There were this was a 5-point study for us in terms of how we approach this. Like any other study, you have to rely on data. Data is driven or is provided to us through familiar sources like the Census Bureau, community housing affordability data, HUD data, et cetera. And so we relied on those sources, but we also relied on another critical element on the ground, and that was community input and the voices of the community here. So you're going to hear an element of this that also talks through or identifies what the community felt was important to housing need here as well, which made this a very robust and comprehensive work as a result of the fact that it wasn't just driven by outsiders or hard numbers. It was driven by the people who have to live in this community and have impacts as a result of this community. So those 5 points are quickly this. We conducted existing and future conditions analysis, public engagement meetings to obtain community input, in which we were here on the ground twice for that purpose, conducted housing need and market analysis. We reviewed programs and policies and provided an assessment. We also exercised the opportunity to look at best practices and national best practices that help support some of the recommendations that we provided throughout this work. So what I'm going to talk about today are a few things. We know now, as a result of this study, that Winston-Salem, as with Forsyth County, is growing in population. Has been growing now for over the past 5 years. Winston-Salem is also growing in households. And this study also points out that there is an anticipated projected demand for housing as a result of not just the current growth, but the future growth that's anticipated over the next 10 years. So a lot of what we say and a lot of recommendations are driven by that underlying premise, in that the city is experiencing growth. And it's critical time now to meet the needs of that growth because households, because of the increase in households. We found there is a mismatch between the types of housing and the types of households that exist here in the current state. I'll talk through that. There are some losses, of course, of affordability here. Many families are dealing with cost burden, and many of those households happen to be those who are within the 0 to 50% area median income. So we're talking about lower income households who are most impacted and are feeling the pinch more than others here. Then I'm going to talk through changes in what we call access to opportunity. I'm going to make a point or two about housing and transportation and how that relationship between housing and transportation has affected something critical to what we believe is happening here, which are early stages of gentrification. So with that, I'm going to move now to the strategic framework in the document. There's 5 critical objectives that set up this entire report. 5 primary objectives to meet one critical goal. The 5 objectives to meet one goal, and that is to address the housing needs that we have found do exist here. So I'm going to go now to the framework. I'm looking for objective 1 on this larger document.
This is not an
Here we go.
So it would be that.
So it doesn't allow me to move back. Oh, there we go. Okay, I see. It just jumps, but that's okay. Yeah, that's all right. So I'm going to start with, yes, I am, thank you. So I'm going to start with objective 1,
We believe there's a need to focus on closing the housing supply gap between what we call affordable and available units. Affordable and available units, and this is a term used by HUD, Housing and Urban Development, because what it is really a measure that says it looks at how many houses are affordable at certain income levels, but how many of those houses are actually occupied by people of higher income. And the difference that HUD has measured is the number that says these are then units that are not available for those who really should occupy those units based on the affordability. So we're going to talk about that. And then at the same time focus on the demand for new housing units. So that would be page 17 of the larger document that I'm referring to. So we now know, based on our study and based on the focus we're asking council to consider, here is that 14,663 net new units of housing will be demanded in Winston-Salem by 2027. So over the next 10 years, over 14,000 new units of housing will be demanded. And what we have found is that over half of those units will be demanded by older adults. A good share of those, and the numbers are cited in the report, will also be demanded by individuals between the ages of 25 and 44. So Winston-Salem will see an increase in younger people here coming to the city. But what you will not likely see are an increase in the number of individuals between the ages of 44 and 64. So it's that middle-age group that will eventually shrink here in the city. There is also a shortage of housing. So as we think about the need for housing, for new housing, based on new units, the current state of housing here is what we're asking council to consider. 8,433 affordable rental units for families. That's the shortage, and the shortage are for families that are 30% of area median income. So the lower income population, there's a shortage of affordable and available homes for this group. There is likewise a shortage for families at the 50% AMI level, 7,411, for over a total of nearly 16,000 units. So what are some of the actions then that can help address these two things I've just mentioned? The shortage of affordable and available, particularly at the lower income echelon, and then the demand for new housing that you should anticipate over the next 10 years. How will housing be available and be met for these groups? We offer many actions in the plan, so I'll leave it to your own opportunities to have reviewed those. But the ones I'm going to highlight here today are these. We're asked that there's consideration to employing a multi-dimensional funding strategy coupled with your general obligation bond funding, with perhaps county HFA programs. In other words, create a layered investment approach that ensures that some of this housing gap, based on supply and based on demand, you begin to kind of chip away at that over time. I know funding is not it's not magical, doesn't fall out of the sky, but I do know that by looking at this in a multidimensional way, perhaps can make a difference. One of the ways we explored the viability of this type of option was looking at private activity bonds, kind of looking at what works and what doesn't, something you're currently not using, but exploring the possibility of what that could potentially look like. So I'd like to take a moment to just kind of talk about that. I'm not going to go through every item in all of the slides here, but I do believe it's really critical to talk about how this private activity bond opportunity could work, and it could be an opportunity. Really believe that this is an approach that requires a layering also. Layering of equity and layering of capital is potentially needed here. It better enables developers to establish affordable rent levels. when it is layered with another source of capital. Private activity bonds lowers borrowing costs, which can make affordable rental housing certainly more financially feasible. PABs have lower interest rates, so that's a favorable opportunity here. It has lower debt service and potentially higher loan amounts. But what we believe would be most effective if the consideration is given to a private activity bond is that it is combined with the 4% tax credit. And the reason is because 4% tax credits are less competitive than the 9%, as you well know. Lower income projects financed with proceeds from private activity bonds under a state cap are eligible here in North Carolina for the 4% tax credit set aside without having to compete for credits in any normal competitive application situation often run by state housing agencies, the North Carolina state housing agencies in particular. So if we think about what could potentially be the advantages of looking at this are lower borrowing costs, making affordable rental housing more feasible, because the interest on private activity bonds is tax-free, the interest rates the bonds hold is lower than market rates. Developers using these bond financing can then support higher loan amounts. So in some ways, it's not any different than some of the other capital vehicles we might, or incentives you might consider, but this might be looked at differently if we think about some of the disadvantages of this. So I'm presenting both sides. Developers tend to shy away from private activity bond transactions because they can be cumbersome. Developers tend to want to avoid the challenges of coordinating so many different parties, lenders, credit issuers, legal services, and the like. Permitting processes. It can take up to 4 to 6 months to close, from beginning to close on a private activity bond. And so it would have to be thought about in terms of where geographically here in Winston-Salem, first of all, would be the greatest need, which is identified in our study. And because of potentially high origination fees for these types of projects, they are usually used to finance small projects, anywhere between 100 and 150 units, and mainly because of the cost consideration. But it is an option. It is an option to consider. The other thing we're asking...
Excuse me, I don't want to interrupt you at this point, but what I am going to ask, though, we're only on the first item. We have 5 specific categories in here that we want to go through.
Move through.
And it is an amazing amount of information that we have and some good stuff there, and I want to afford the opportunity for the committee to engage in some dialogue here. So if we can hit those and hit that information, it would be helpful to be able to allow for the committee and other council members to engage in some dialogue, because we still have one other item on the agenda that we want to get to as well. And so I'm going to ask council members, committee members, if we can hold our questions, write them down so that we can engage and give our opportunity to get through the presentation.
And I'll be mindful of time as well. Thank you. The other action we're asking to be considered here as it relates to housing supply, filling the housing supply gap and the demand, is that the 3-9 bonus density for affordable housing ordinance be modified. It has come to our attention on several occasions that this is an ordinance that has not been attractive for developers here. And we believe that there's a need to establish a review committee to rethink and think through what could be sufficient incentives here for developers and what has not worked with this particular ordinance that was originally established to ensure affordable housing was the result in the last 20 years. And this is what we have been informed of. Another action could be defer development fees, upsell to direct developments targeting particular communities with greatest need. I'm going to give you one example that I would encourage those interested to look at. One community that has really layered incentives and done it well is Sorry, Council Lady Adams, I have to talk about Durham.
I've been to the development.
Yes, indeed. So it's Southside community. They have engaged in an amazing revitalization project that has had multiple phases, both multifamily and single family, and it is working in this community. This is a city that has, this is a project actually, it was multi-phased, 20 acres, southern edge of downtown, which we are finding here at Enterprise that most of the issues with not just gentrification, but the need for more affordable housing, the loss of affordable housing, and even the cost burdens are always on the urban core. They're always adjacent to the downtown area. I mean, if we were to just look across the state, which we travel all over the nation with these types of projects, the patterns are very consistent from city to city. It is a wave that America is in terms of the potential of now creating not urban poverty, but the movement now of lower income outward from the downtown area, creating suburban, potentially suburban poverty. But there are ways to address it. And I would say that Southside and Durham would be a project that should be examined very closely as a multi-phased approach to how affordable housing can be done. And I list there who some of the financing partners are. So I know the city of Winston-Salem struggles with, like any other city, capital resources. But again, it was this layering approach with the Department of Housing, the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, the city, and a few local banks and a private investor. For us here at Enterprise, it's like that's a really perfect formula of partners that have resources that can make a difference here. So I'm going to move on then. So those are my high-level approaches, or at least the ones that I think, with the interest of time, that we can talk about today. But there's others listed here in the larger document that I'd ask you to consider. The second objective here points to preservation of housing. And I know that's a critical priority here for not just, council officials, but the residents themselves, right? About improving the maintenance, quality, and overall preservation of renter and owner housing. What I will say, pulling out from a lot of the recommendations we have here, we do believe it's critical to generate local revenues by growing the city's housing finance fund over time. Easy to say, hard to do. But we really believe that that fund can potentially be fueled by a list of activities that we have in this larger report that really point to how to address two things: taxing vacant properties and how to go about that. But then that's a supply side. But then on the demand side, it's really about how to create better working relationships, or perhaps improve working relationships with tenant and landlords. And we've outlined ways in which that could potentially happen. Some examples that we came across when we were thinking about this study around preservation and how to address this. Housing Reservation Fund was an example of a city actually in Maryland, a smaller city that was successful in Montgomery County, that decided that they were going to just create a reserve fund that was particularly funded just by the collection of taxes collected on vacant properties. A separate fund was set aside for that. The other thing that I think is really critical here is to perhaps adopt a housing vacancy plan that includes the feasibility of a land bank. Many cities are now really moving to two things: creating community land trusts and community land banks. And in this case, as it relates to preservation, land banking can potentially be a viable opportunity here, because what it does is it allows governmental entities or even a nonprofit that's focused on the conversion of vacant, abandoned, and tax delinquent properties, and then repurposes them, obviously, into more productive use. But here's the biggest difference. Oftentimes when properties, when there's a land bank entity, it effectively and efficiently allows it can undertake activities more efficiently and sometimes more effectively than public entities being the holders of that. So I know we only have here in the city a few, perhaps CDCs or what have you. It was another project, in fact, I will share this with you. We've recommended that there be a creation even of another nonprofit that didn't exist. Perhaps that's something that's an option here as well, to create a new nonprofit for the purposes of land banking. So those will be the two actions that I'd highlight here today for that purpose. For objective number 3, I'm going to move down here because it really talks about now creating this better balance between housing units produced and the size of households. So here we found that in Winston-Salem, population growth and household growth over the last 5 years has created really a disproportionate amount, an increase in older adults. And as the city prepares for future growth, we recommend that you align actual household size with actual unit size. Approximately 68%, nearly 70% of the housing units here in Winston-Salem is occupied by one-person or two-person households. And that's as of recent census data that we found this finding. However, 2- and 3-bedroom units are the most common here, which comprise about 71% of all units in the stock. So this observation far exceeds the current number of 1-bedroom units, which is the largest share of households. So what we're really saying here is two things. There's a need for structures that are smaller. We call it the missing middle you have here, 2 to 4 units, which isn't necessarily tied to household size. But then we're also saying there needs to be more housing preferences. There certainly is a need for more choices here, both from a preference standpoint and for the number of units based on unit size. Residents, for example, who like single-family dwellings might be willing to rent in a 50-unit building, but might be okay even living in a duplex. So we ask that there's a balance now, that right sizing needs to happen here. We found larger size units, 3 to 7 family households was the missing middle. And so what does that mean in terms of housing type? So when we think of now the types of housing that are predominantly needed, the data says that households 65 and older, because there's going to be a growing older population, there's going to be a need for probably smaller size units. Young adult populations between the age of 25 and 44, as I mentioned. Special needs population, including the disabled. And then households with incomes below 80% AMI. The greatest need being between 0 and 30%, and 30 to 50%. So types of housing should align with those key categorical groups. Some of the community responded to this in interesting ways because a lot of individuals from the public hearings and the public meetings felt that, and I provide you with a full list of the types of housing they felt were needed, but what I really pulled from this to talk about today was they want to explore the feasibility of co-housing units and senior villages as affordable housing options. Community has also said...
Excuse me, I'm going to push you just a little bit more.
Yeah.
I'm going to push you. It's good information, but I do want to make sure we get some time for some questions.
Any questions? Should I keep continue?
Yeah, I'm saying I want you to...
Okay, so I'm going to move it on. All right. And
hit it.
so, so what I think I'm going to do, though, now is, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the really key point here in terms of objective 4, and that is to prevent potential displacement of low-income households from downtown Winston-Salem and contiguous neighborhoods, particularly in the eastern portion of the city. What we're really beginning to see here, in addition to affordability, we also looked at the broader affordability of living in a particular location. And that meant housing and transportation. Overall, we find that Winston-Salem has really above average when you look at housing and transportation combined. And the maps are in the report where you can really visually see this. We're finding that it's rather affordable here when you think about costs relative to incomes for a city of your size, averaging somewhere in between 240, 250,000 people. But, however, the low population density, land use, development favoring more sprawling development patterns, residents have to commute longer distances, and in most cases can't rely on public transportation to get there. So when you see the map itself on where your bus routes are, they start from the inner core of downtown and move outward, but then there's a band around where they end. And we're really concerned about that, and I'll explain to you why that's the case. Winston-Salem also doesn't follow the typical trend we see nationally with respect to how housing and transportation costs play out. Although transportation costs are higher for residents living further outside the city, housing prices currently remain relatively low in the downtown area relative to the outer city and the surrounding county. The main exception here is the west side of the city, where the area north of I-40 and south of 67, where housing prices are significantly higher. This also means that if these downtown neighborhoods do start to experience gentrification, the problem will be twofold. One will be that those current low to moderate income residents, and many of them, many of your public housing authorities are located close to the downtown, many of whom are people of color, will get displaced and be forced to move to other areas with less access to jobs and potentially services. But unlike in many other places where we see this happening, the housing on the outer edges of Winston-Salem is not more affordable, especially given the lack of rental housing stock. And transportation costs are certainly higher. They may now have to own a car to get to work, perhaps unless there's consideration to how bus route transit will work over time if gentrification should happen and the potential threat for displacement of lower income should happen. So we see signs of gentrification. We do find that Winston-Salem is beginning those early signs because what we look at is the racial shifts that are beginning to happen. African Americans are decreasing at a faster rate from the inside core of the city to the outside. We look at education levels. So we look at various variables throughout the census data to help us understand the dynamic of how that works. And the back of the study, I can recite the page, will show you where we have borrowed from the University of Portland model to help us help us with supporting the variables that show which shifts are really happening that help define gentrification. I remember months ago when I was here, there was a question on council about, can you help define gentrification and can you tell us if it's really happening? And the answer is, yes, it is. It's happening here like many other cities. And so what we're asking you to do or to think about considering is revisiting some policies that you already have on the books. Revisiting some policies you already have on the books. You have a citizen participation plan that has a displacement policy in it. And part of that displacement policy that was updated June 2016 says that there should be consideration given to a feasibility study that helps understand that if gentrification or displacement is beginning to happen, there are certain actions that should be taken at this point to understand how to address the needs of families that may be impacted by this. So we're asking that there's proactive measures taken to that particular policy you already have on the books if you haven't already, and begin to look at what a prevention plan could look like for this city, or to at least help minimize displacement.
And I'm going to ask.
So I'm going to stop here.
In this, I was going to ask in terms of if there's to summarize there, and I'm going to pull around to committee and council members for questions. Do you have anything else then to summarize?
No, I can reserve it for questions, I suspect.
Okay. All right, I'm going to start on my right and come around. Oh, Councilman Bessie.
Let me defer to Councilmember Evans.
Okay.
We want to thank you for this study, for providing us with all of this information. I guess the next steps for the council, once we ratify this, accept it for information, again, is to implement some of the strategic items that you've given us, recommendations, just like you stated about the displacement policy. I was already emailing the city attorney, send us a copy of the displacement policy, because now we got to tie all of this together. As you said, we have to go now get, again, community folk to participate in this process, but it gives us something in hand, again, suggestions of how we can partner with developers and the other layered partnerships that we need to have to make this possible. Community development, and we may have to go, and the city manager, get the Durham folk up here, or we need to go to Durham, because when I saw that project and what they did at that time, Mayor Bill Bell, who grew up here in Winston, graduated from Atkins High School, he took me on a tour of it because he was just that proud of that. And he had his partnership people there to talk about what they had to do. And it's successful. Again, people have the perception that we don't want better. We want better. But see, we have to fess up that we ain't got all the answers, that we need help in helping us to get to the next level. And sometimes when we're emotional, we can be emotional, but we got to move beyond emotion and get to the point where we actually got some action going on and some solutions. So again, I see this as a working model for us to go work on, again, prioritize the council like we did with our strategic plan for the city. Mr. City Manager, we now got to go do this with this, because it's all hands on deck. All hands on deck.
All right, Councilmember McIntosh.
Yeah, there's an awful lot of stuff in here that I think is good best practices kind of things, and I think that's what we're looking for, is what are other models that we can look at to model that. Couple pointers. I mean, the number of overall units required over that period of time, I think it's 1,400 a year, and I think probably that's not going to be an issue. The problem is the affordable units. Yes. I mean, I think we probably are producing somewhere around 1,400 a year. The problem is we're not producing the affordable numbers, right? So overall housing would be great, but we're still going to have that inability to provide 30 to 50% AMI.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I'm very interested to learn more about PABs. I don't really follow it. Are they treated like historic tax credits? We'll do that offline, because I think that'll go way into the weeds. I want to learn more about the bonus density, because honestly, that's new to me. I'm going to take a bus trip to Southside. We've run up against a couple of issues that play right into this that would help us address density and more affordability, and they haven't been universally accepted in the community. Let's just say that. Auxiliary dwelling units.
Oh, yes.
We had a real difficult time with that. I don't like how that went down. We're now, the next item on the agenda is 283, which both of those to me are critical to address affordability. And we're getting tremendous amount of pushback from the community on those. And those are the types of things that will help affordability, and yet we're getting pushback from the community against them. So just notes, I'm dying to dig into this and really get the weeds on it. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
All right, Councilmember Larson, did you have any comments? No. Okay. All right. All right. A couple thoughts. Number one, has this been sent to full council? Council has a copy of this document, the full document?
I'd remember it.
Well, make sure that the full council has a copy of the full.
We'll send out both the digital, both the full document and the summary.
Right. So, Councilmember. Well, one, I want to say that this has been a long time coming in process to get here. The city manager will recall some years of process of saying that we needed to engage in an active evaluation of housing in this community, and very clearly set forth what the need is. And when we started this process, I was very clear, and I stated that whatever came out of the housing study, recommendations, the numbers, I think anecdotally, a lot of us may have known some of those things, but needed to qualify and quantify that in this manner. But now the responsibility has been placed on this community to respond to what is there. The statements and the challenges that exist has now been put in our hands to say, what do we do with this information and how do we respond? And there will be a generation of people who will look back at this moment and ask, what did this city do to respond to the challenges that were very much laid on the table that we have when we face the issues of affordable housing in this community. And so I say that to say that we have to do something, and we have to take action as a community. Very clearly, the recommendations that were set forth here are not all things that city government can do, but the city has to play an active role of setting the environment that helps to make these things happen. And I pray that when I'm no longer sitting in this chairmanship behind this desk, that the passion around ensuring that this happens continues to go forth, and that we commit ourselves as a city and as a community to ensuring that this is something that is top of mind, and that and I know, Mr. City Manager, staff is going to synthesize this down to something that comes back to committee from an action standpoint of, based upon what we see, what we have. These are action items that the council and the city can actually take action on to help us get to that, which I think is what we need to be able to evaluate and to see. And it gives the council and committee an ability to really understand what that long-term impact will be. Because again, there will be people who will look back and they'll say, the city was presented with this information. And not just city council, but the city as a whole was presented with this. And what did we do with it at that time? Mr. Bessie?
Yeah, a couple of points related to public education and dealing with decision makers. Acronyms. I've learned in dealing with transportation policy details for a number of years that one of the barriers to involving a broad spectrum of community leaders is the tendency for experts to use shorthand that most of the folks who need to understand don't. And I'm effectively starting from scratch in the policy area because I have not developed yet a substantive area expertise in community housing finance issues. Easy example, summary documents. LIHTC, I'm guessing that is low-income housing tax credits.
Yeah.
And that's something that the folks who have studied the area know immediately. I had to guess, and folks who haven't dealt with the area at all, decision makers, community leaders, probably can't even guess in many cases. That's a mere example. For translating the detailed recommendations, or even summarizing the detailed recommendations, we will need a translation to make it accessible to the folks who we need to hit, and sort of more compact summaries of key recommendations. The interplay between housing and transportation is one that I immediately recognize because I have been dealing with transportation policy in more detail for a longer period of time. I believe that I am seeing in the parts of the city that I know in more intimate detail because I've been representing some of them, the intersection between housing affordability moving out and public transit access not moving out.
Not moving out, that's right.
Ironically, for the most part, the relatively higher income areas of my district are at least as likely to be closer in to the city center. which might not have been the case 30 years ago, is now. And the ethnically, racially diverse areas within my ward, my district, are at least as likely to be in the suburban neighborhoods that do not have access to housing, do not have access to public transit in the same way that the closer in neighborhoods do.
Yes.
And with the shift of, the ongoing shift of population with housing affordability higher needs, to further out, we need to understand how the transportation challenges are growing.
Yes.
Candidly, Winston-Salem, I think, was one of the larger cities in the state that did not have a broadly high-quality public transit system for a longer time. And we have only just in recent years started to change that. But while we have been dealing with the quality issue, we have not simultaneously been able to expand the area served by quality public transit. And so we're facing that need at the same time we're still trying to digest a very large increase in the public resources going into our transit system. So we're dealing with that, and then we're already starting to deal with the next challenge of increasing the reach of our public transit system, while our voters are still digesting the dollar size investment we're asking them to put into the public transit system in the areas that it currently serves. That's a part of the challenge that we're dealing with in public education, and we need help from the experts in summarizing, digesting, and translating the recommendations that we need to boost public understanding of on a fairly rapid basis if we're going to move on those recommendations in the time frame that we need to do to keep Winston-Salem a relatively affordable community in housing. So, sorry that I started from a specific example and kind of moved out into the community education need more broadly. But yeah, and
taking away time from your own.
We're getting. It's taking a while to make the point, and we're at 6 o'clock.
Mr. Attorney.
Yes.
But no, go.
That's. I will conclude my comments at this point, and note that we will accommodate the start of the Public Works Committee to address the fact that we spent a half an hour on this agenda item when we only had 20 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bessie. All right. Thank you, staff. We'll get Ms. Tosh Logan Ford, Ms. Newman, others will get back here. The questions we have here bring us back some actionable recommendations based on this so that we can continue some evaluation and then actually prepare some action items that we can take as a city and then pull others in the process.
Before we leave this item, let me just say thank you to our presenter.
Yes.
That's doing yeoman work of trying to digest a 2-hour presentation into 20 minutes. And Dr. Newman, thank you to you and your staff for helping over the weekend start getting a handle on the litter on the stick problem in Sunrise.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. We are at a shortened time frame of our committee meeting. I do want to go to G4 for a moment and have some some dialogue here. If the committee chair of Public Works will bear with me for a moment here. And I want to do a quick summary myself and to see if staff wants to bring anything else other folks want to add. Pretty much what we're looking at with UDO, the changes to UDO 283. This went back to the planning board. Planning board had some more conversation on this. There were concerns about certain placements and locations. They added some language that would restrict where this could be put into use. Put in looking at the acreage and land, the 1 acre size property in terms of what could be utilized for it, and then it also restricted that it could only be used in HB zone sites, and thus that removed some of the locations that were originally presented to the council that were potentially eligible for this. Also, there were the questions of how can we have more community engagement if we did this UDO amendment. What were the methods that could be utilized to engage more community engagement? And thus the city attorney's office looked at ways that that could happen, and although it's very clearly said that they're not recommending anyway, but they just very clearly laid out what could happen within allowing for more community engagement. And there were 2 options that were at hand that could potentially allow for citizens to be heavily engaged or have a voice in that process. And this is something we've been having some discussion on for some time, and so I didn't want to disallow the opportunity for us to have some short dialogue on this and hear if there were additional questions that committee members or council members present had, or if there was something that we were prepared to take action on either way, but did want to make sure we sum that up into a place that we could hear it. And just to the staff, did I miss something that you wanted to say? If not, I'm going to ask the committee members to share, jump in.
I just want to make sure you highlight the growth corridors and activity centers that we're recommending that the HB sites be limited to 1 acre along growth corridors and activity centers. And we have some close-ups here. The circles are HB zoned areas that would not be included in this. And you can see here you have the Peters Creek Parkway Growth Corridor, Solace Creek Parkway Growth Corridor, Stratford Road. These would be included, but then this area, Lexington, Waughtown, would not be included because they're outside the activity centers.
Right. And again, back to the community concerns that we heard, and if I heard them correctly, there were in 2 clear areas. 1, the developments encroaching on neighborhoods in certain ways, and then 2, that there would not be a community voice in the process. And so how do we address those concerns? Because and so from there, I'm gonna pull back and come around the table to see if the information presented helped committee members and council members understand more what we were looking at with this UDO amendment. Comments from members of the committee?
Very briefly, I think that limiting the initial movement to the HBs instead of the HBs and GOs might address a lot of the community concerns. And this is one of those issues. Councilor McIntosh and I were a bit on opposite sides on the accessory dwellings issue because of the impact on existing neighborhoods. I'm more inclined to his side of the thinking with this particular issue, because we're not talking about changing the nature of existing residential. We're talking about an additional technique for facilitating a multifamily development within what is existing commercial area, which I think is something we should be moving forward with. I'll leave it. Comment with that.
Councilor Adams?
Yes. I read the summation of what the planning board agreed with about, I agree with the acreage recommendation, but I also agree with them about, and we just heard a report, that we don't have transportation and we don't have the affordable housing and people where it needs to be, that we can make this a walkable community. And again, we're talking about people that are not like most of the people in this room, that they need to be near shopping centers and grocery stores and drug stores and things like that. And I understand what these other communities feel. But I also think that, for me, I have to look at the other side of that voice that we don't hear down here a lot. And that is the recommendation that we can change the legacy, the area plan update, and the corridor study, and include certain sites. Because Patterson Avenue on the north side and the northeast side needs to have some housing on it, because you got a shopping center, and you got the flea market, and you got Lowe's, and you got all this stuff, but there are no houses there. And they need sidewalks and stuff. So I agree with what the planning board said. I agree with them. They had a 7-2 vote. I agree with them.
All right, Councilman McIntosh.
My understanding from reading this is not, did Geo get pulled from this?
What?
No, okay.
Councilmember McIntosh, you're correct. The planning board did not actually pull Geo from this. Certainly, if the council wishes, it's certainly your prerogative to pull Geo. But basically, what the planning board studied was just further restricting HB, since that was the district that they heard the most concern.
Right. My sense was that Geo would not be as impactful on residential areas and neighborhoods, as people sense that HB would be a bigger impact than Geo. So I just want to make sure we're not pulling that off the table.
Just really quickly, a couple of blue areas on the map, those are the only Geos.
Right. So it doesn't exist as much, and it's not in places that would cause as much impact. No, I think we'll get more housing out of it. I think we'll get more units, and this is all about supply and demand. If there are more units out there, prices are going to come down. So I'm all for it.
Councilmember Larson.
The thing that has bothered me from the time we started this discussion was the ability to put in residential units within an HB or a office setting without using the architectural guidelines or standards that would apply to a residential unit. So you have architectural guidelines, standards, zoning requirements, setbacks, height, elevations, what have you, that apply to businesses that we would not allow, for example, in an RS zoning. At least that's my understanding of it. And if that's the case, we have a built-in conflict in the sense of design of any residential unit that would go on to HB or general office zoning. Is that a valid?
The setbacks and the height limits would be the same, and it would give it more flexibility if, in case a building needed to be converted to a commercial use, it would have the setbacks for that district, so it doesn't cause a problem in the future. If a building is converted from one use to another, it could stay in that district.
And Councilmember Larson, just to further address your point, the way this would be addressed is the land use in the Unified Development Ordinances, residential, multifamily, and that land use would have the same design or use conditions whether the land use is being developed in a residential multifamily district or in a business district such as HB or GO. As Kelly mentioned, the heights in the district would be different, but in terms of any design requirements for the units such that they exist, or things like the open space requirements for multifamily complexes, those would be the same across all districts that allow the use.
Okay.
I'm still not entirely clear about, the process then. There is no site plan review. If you have HB zoning and a developer comes in and it's going to be up against a residential neighborhood.
Well, I'm going to actually pull back around your question, Councilman Larson there, and hopefully we'll connect the dots real quick and see if we can come back around. Quick question to the city attorney. The two processes that your office looked at under the review for citizens' input there, where they could be included in that process, the specific place of legislative review, what does that mean? Is that our normal process of rezoning and examining that? Right. And so, as chair, I wanted to kind of see if we can bring some resolution to what we looked at in this. And so my recommendation would be, and if there's a support from the council, would be that we would move with the recommendation of the planning board, adding to that the legislative place where it would allow for it to have to be the special use piece where you would have the rezoning, you would be able to have the public comment. Council members would not be restricted from having the dialogue and the conversation with the community in that process, and you would have it just as, if I understand it right, the normal special use rezoning piece. That's my position. I have to get somebody to recommend that, but that would be my position in reference to that. Is that how that will work, City Attorney?
Explain to me how is it going to be only on a special use rezoning process? How do you envision that working?
How you said it right here. In the sense of the one option is to require special use district rezoning for the use which would require approval from council in a legislative setting. And then another alternative is to require the property owner to obtain a special use permit for the use either before City Council or the Zoning Board of Adjustment. This option would be governed by quasi-judicial procedure. And I'm not saying the quasi-judicial procedure. It's the former.
Residential and the HB, are you saying it's not going to be allowed? You just go through the special use rezoning piece? I'm just trying to figure out procedurally how you're putting this together.
I'm saying I'm fine with the allowed in the HB zone, but with the recommendation from the planning board of what those constraints are, and then putting with that the ability to add the community input, that part. Am I saying? I think I'm saying this right. Where's I see folks' faces. What am?
Could I interject for just a minute?
Everybody's looking like, huh?
I just want to make sure that the council is understanding that what that proposal would be analogous to what we have now, which is if you wanted to do residential multifamily in highway business, you would have to petition for, in all likelihood, a special use legislative rezoning just to a residential district. So if the council's goal is ultimately to further what Ms. Newman's staff consultant just presented, a way to make it easier to do missing middle and affordable housing, that may not be the way to go about that, because again, the goal of staff when we came up with this was to make it easier to incentivize redevelopment of these existing areas. Certainly, again, it's the council's prerogative to have more public discourse on these issues, but to make something a special use rezoning is basically just going to be duplicating the process we have now, but calling it something else.
Well, I gave my opinion, and so it's 8 people on the council, so that was my standalone opinion in reference to that.
Just real quickly, I think what we've gone through with back and forth with planning board and here is to set up a set of guidelines in which the need for those special use zoning requests are very limited by the locations that you can do them in the activity corridors and the size. That intent was that if people wanted to build in those, then you would not have the pushback from the neighborhoods because they're not going to be impacted.
That's exactly correct.
Okay.
Right. Okay. Well, is there any comment from?
Yeah, I honestly was not prepared for this as an action item today
Okay.
because there's a great deal of background material that was not attached to our packet, and it was a report. So I don't think I could be well informed voting on a recommendation to council to move forward today. I mean, I can simply tell you that my inclination is to go with some variation of what's recommended by the planning board that would not require a special use rezoning. And the question in my mind is, to what do we apply that change? And even though the hang on a second. The GA zoning is not a lot of the affected area. It is a lot of what I would see as the potentially problematic affected area in my ward, where I would expect to see unforeseen impacts to nearby existing residential areas. The HB zoning in the areas that I'm most familiar with in detail. While it did draw a lot of the pushback, I think are areas that, based on my familiarity, are going to have actually less adverse, potentially, impact on existing adjacent residential areas.
This is an info item, right?
Yeah, it's info. And so, like there was the comments there. I was just trying to get us to a place where we can get to, we can get it. So I would like to see an action item come back. And what I'm hearing is that, in general, what the planning board has recommended has made folks a bit more comfortable in terms of separating, pushing back a little bit from neighborhoods, giving that space to neighborhoods in the area. At the East Ward levels and the location in the East Ward, I have no problem with the locations where they are, because that's actually areas where we want development, and much of the plans in place say that's where you should do it. And so.
When we did the legal research, it was based on what was brought before, but now that it's limiting the application, I really don't think, especially with rezoning, we are with the process that's being proposed.
Right. Councilman McIntyre?
Can we get parcel ID numbers on geo stuff? How long is that list? Is it huge?
That's certainly something we could prepare for you. I'm not sure how many parcels there are, but we can prepare you a list of the.
It seems like a fairly finite thing, and if we look at those on an individual basis, and Councilmember Bessie is comfortable with those, then I think we sort of eliminate that fear of.
What may be the best thing for us to do, since there's so few geo concentrations, we could just make maps for each of those geo concentrations with attendant parcel lists.
Yeah.
All right. Great. Councilmember Larson?
I'm inclined. Well, first of all, my concerns revolve a little bit around public input, and where if we pass a piece of ordinance here that establishes new zoning criteria, whatever, for residential and commercial, where's the public input, or is there any at that point? And I'd like to have I'd like to have real clarity on that as we go forward on that. Second of all, I want to be clear that I am supportive of having additional I think residential use is a primary use in this city, and we have to address that, and we've already begun to hear that issue. So we've got to find ways to provide good housing in accessible locations to businesses and what have you. So I am sympathetic to the basic concept. I think we have to be judicious about where we place it, and I think it needs to be transparent in the process of how we're going to install this process. So what I'm looking forward to hear from staff is the questions that I sort of asked earlier, and I didn't really understand the answer, quite honestly. But you'll tell me again after line, I'm sure, about how the interface is going to occur between these kinds of proposed developments, how they come forward, and how they're presented, the new ones, the ones that already exist and are going to be changed as a result of this. That we have developments in the corridors now that we can now add this unit into that landscape, and how that's going to occur, and then new developments that occur, how that's going to be handled. And I just want to understand the process of that pretty clearly. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate you for your presentation. Any other comments you have for us?
That sounds good, and we'll bring you back some more information next month.
Bring us back some more information and a couple actions.
Correct.
That we.
Information is good, but action is better.
A few actions.
Thank you.
All right. One last thing and this is just to staff, a request to staff. Want to look at how we can examine the potential ability on expanding what we consider central business district eastward, particularly for the benefits of how we use certain economic development tools, and so how we can expand that. Bring that item back to us. Okay. All right.
If we're going to talk about expanding the district, I think we ought to look citywide on that, because south of 40 is equally challenged.
As I asked, you heard the second request, but please bring back what I asked. You heard the other council member as well, so hear that. But central business district, understand what that is, and that's a totally different thing. So central business district staff, please. Thank you so much. All right.
Mr. Chairman, Public Works, unless I hear objection from staff, will gavel in 5 minutes after you gavel out.
All right. We're adjourned.